So hello, everyone. It is the top of the hour, and I would like to welcome you all. So you are here for the Urban and Suburban Ecosystem series of titled Living in Suburbia that we put together for you. My name is Hillary. I'm from the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Westchester County in partnership with the Westchester County Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as the Native Plant Center of Westchester Community College and the Watershed Agriculture Council. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for seeing the first installment, which is about soil, what's in your yard. Just a few things real fast. If you can make sure to keep yourself muted, please, for the entire duration of the presentation, just so we don't have any kinds of noise throughout the presentation. There will be time for questions at the end. Feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat, which is you can open up and put in, and this session will be recorded. And just to keep you up to date, our next installment is on Thursday, June 10th, and it's about water. Water, where does it come from? Where does it go? So this is another one from 12 to 1, and we have some great speakers lined up. Mary Lynn Malone, who is a conservation educator from the Orange County Water Authority, and Dr. Daniel Van Abs, who is an associate professor from Rutgers University. So without further ado, let's get started. Like I said, my name is Hillary Dufer. I'm the Horticulture and Environment Program Manager at Cornell Cooperative Extension in Westchester County. And today I'm going to be talking to all of you about soil. What's in your yard? You know, everyone has soil. Let's kind of check into it and see what we can find out. Maybe everybody will learn something new today. What we'll talk about: what is soil? How does it form? And what makes a soil healthy? These are all great things to know when you're trying to do things around. Sorry about that. Looks like I got muted. So what we're going to learn about is what is soil, how does it form, and what makes a soil healthy. So first, we're going to think about what's the definition of soil. Soil has many different definitions depending on who you are, which is why it's such a hard thing to pinpoint sometimes. If you're a gardener or a farmer, it could be the loose surface material of the earth in which plants grow. If you're a geologist, you might think of it as the outer layer of the Earth's crust. If you're a writer, it could be a static skin of the earth. You know, there's so many different words that you can use to describe what soil is, because it's such a big body. But let's think from a general. What is soil? So we're going to look at this for a second. So I'm going to pull up my laser pointer. And so soil is the dynamic interface between the lithosphere, which is the rigid outer part of the earth, and it consists of the crust and the upper mantle. So it's this part right here, right, the lithosphere. And the atmosphere, or the whole mass of air surrounding the earth. The atmosphere is going to be the air, right? The hydrosphere, or all the water that's on Earth's surface, water, and the biosphere, which is where living things are. So it's where all of this meets together is where soil is. And in the perfect world, soil is going to be 45% minerals, 5% organic matter, 25% air, and 25% water. But again, this is in the perfect world. It doesn't always happen that way. So every soil has a soil profile. And what a profile is each layer that the soil has. So you have the O horizon. Each profile is made up of horizons. You have the O horizon, which is the top right here, and it's called the organic horizon, and it's where organic debris and materials tend to accumulate, right? You have roots, you have plants, you have animals, things of that nature. The A horizon, which is this one down here, is going to be the topsoil, and the topsoil is usually rich in minerals and organic matter, and when you're planting through the organic matter and into the A horizon. Sometimes there's an E. It's not always present, just like in this picture, it's not present. So I had to put in this line. So the E horizon can be between the A and the B, and it's the zone of eluviation. And what that means is that it's usually a layer of like sand and silts where material from the A comes down through it into the B, like different nutrients and things of that nature. And like I said, it's not always present in all soil profiles. After that, you have the B horizon, which is right here, which is the subsoil. And the subsoil doesn't have much organic matter in it, but it can have minerals and nutrients that were being pushed down from the topsoil down to the subsoil. You have the C horizon, which is a parent material, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And also not pictured is the R horizon, which is just the bedrock. Okay. So these soil profiles make up the soil that you have. And then the soils have series, which are soils that are grouped together have similar profiles, and from all those series, they're then classified into soil orders. So this is the 12 soil orders that are used to classify all the soil on the earth. So all those soils are going to fit into these 12 categories, and they're chosen based on the soil properties, how they're developed, and if there's any horizons that are present or not present. So now we get the gist of kind of what soil might start to be. Let's talk about how it's formed. There's 5 different ways that help to create a soil. There's parent material, which we had discussed was one of the horizons. There's climate, there's living organisms, there's landscape position, and there's time, because soil takes time to be made. So parent material is usually has a strong effect on the type of soil that's developed and also the rate at which it is developed. You know, if you have a dense clayey structure of your parent material, then it's probably going to take a little bit longer to be made. And most of it is mineral material. So it's like a volcano ash, partially weathered rock, sediments that are moved through water and wind, or rock fragments from glaciers. And these things are, so you can see it right here. You have your C horizon. And usually freezing and thawing and wetting and drying can crack this material and start to make soil. And just fun fact, our state soil is a honeoye soil. We have a state bird. We have, you know, a state flower. We also have a state soil. And this honeoye series occurs really mostly only in New York. And we had just talked about the orders. The order of this soil is alpha sol. So climate is another factor when you're talking about making soil. So plant material is really beneficial, and there's a lot that depends on climate, right? You know, if you have a hot climate, a cold climate, a lot of water, no water, these kinds of things affect the environment. So the available water determines the amount of weathering and the amount of movement of the materials. So you can see that warm climates are have a lot of rapid plant growth and also have a high decomposition rate. And organic matter is produced a lot. So if we look at this middle picture here, this left side, you can see lush green lawn, you can see a tree. All these things have root mass and insects and things of that nature. So you're going to have high organic matter, and you're going to have really, fertile, potentially fertile soil, depending on the other factors. And you look on this right side and it's barren and it's sand, so different climates affect how soil is made. And the soil temperatures and the chemical weathering rates also kind of depict what kind of soil you're going to have. This picture down here shows rainfall. Rainfall can also indicate what's going on and change things. Rainfall causes leaching through the soil, nutrients, minerals leaching through the soil. It dissolves some minerals, and it can also be acidic. So you can have different acidic compounds, changing the pH potentially, but it would take a long time. So another one that we were talking about is living organisms. Now, I know we're not in Oregon, but I actually really love this quote. Every time you take a step in a mature Oregon forest, your feet are being supported on the backs of 16,000 invertebrates, held up by an average of 120,000 legs. They're everywhere, right? You have your millipedes, you have your sow bugs, and your centipedes. These are all different invertebrates that are in the soil. And obviously those aren't just the only ones, they're just the ones that, I've talked about right now. Also living organisms, you have plants in the soil. So plants affect the development of the upper layers of the soil and organic matter. These root systems are going to hold on to the soil and really protect it. So if you have root systems in, and if you have different foliage on top, you're going to have less runoff because you don't have bare soil. It's going to help with recycling nutrients between the levels of the soil, between the horizons, and can also help with greater air movement and help to prevent leaching because they're using all of the water. And then also in the soil are fungi, bacteria, and protozoa. These are very small. They're one-cell organisms. They decompose dead organic matter. So this right here is an example of one of those kind of fungi. So these white structures are roots under magnification. And all these clear structures that might be hard to see, but all this clear tubes are a fungi called mycorrhiza. And these mycorrhiza have a symbiotic relationship between the fungus and the plant that it's attached to. It's kind of like a natural infection. Seems wrong, right? But it's actually really good for the plants. It's estimated that around 80% of plants have a relationship with some sort of mycorrhiza, and there's a whole bunch of species. It's not just one. And so basically how it works is the plant gives the fungi sugar and carbon that they need to survive. And the roots can only get to the water, can only get to the nutrients that they're touching. So the mycorrhiza acts as a support system. So it can get them to reach further distances and help get them nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. And since living organisms are fun, there's just so many, can't leave it to just one slide. There's also earthworms, right? So these are some fun studies out of Penn State. One pasture study showed that earthworms consume between 20 and 40 tons of soil per acre per year. That's a lot of soil. In another study, it showed that earthworms were estimated to consume 4 to 10% of the top 6 inches of soil annually. So we have a lot of soil that these earthworms are helping to aggregate and helping to make better. So an earthworm like this one up here, they tend to have vertical burrowing from top to bottom, which increases the porosity of the soil and by these burrows. And the castings or poop is high in nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. So it's great for all these plants that need these different nutrients to survive. And I will admit that most of the earthworms in the United States actually native. They're mostly from Europe. They were introduced, with moving freight from one country to another. But they're doing well and everything seems to be going okay, except for these guys down here. So this is an example of an invasive jumping worm. So these guys come from Asia, and there's a few different species of them. This is just a picture of one, and they go through organic matter faster. They grow faster and they reproduce faster, and they fill the soil with like a grainy, dry casting, nothing nutritious, nothing helping for the plant. So you can tell them apart because the clitellum or the collar, which is this part right here, is smooth as opposed to some of the other non-natives that are here that are a little bumpy. And they also are like a cream to white color. And along with the different earthworms, there's also something called a nematode. So nematodes are still microscopic, but they're also multicellular animals. They move around in water films. They can consume things like bacteria, fungi, and protozoa. And there's good and bad, just like the earthworms. So here's just an example of what a nematode looks like. You can use the good nematodes for things like treatment of grubs in your lawn, for treatment of thrips, fungus gnats. So they can be used beneficially, but there's also some bad guys there too. So this right here is an example of a leaf that has beech leaf disease. So this disease is new and up and coming. It can kill a mature tree in 6 to 10 years and can even kill a seedling faster in as little as a year. And you can see the striping on the leaves. It's kind of like leathery and darker. And so they don't know much about it. There's no cure. The research is still going on, but they have linked it to a nematode. Landscape position was another one of those factors that tells you what kind of soil you're going to have, that you could have. And there's localized changes in moisture and temperature. So these things vary greatly. And when rain falls, it moves down either through the profile or down in elevation. One way that you can handle that if you have a lot of water runoff is you can make, like this picture is up here, a rain garden. It's always a really good option. But there's different soil, even though the soil forming factors might be the same on the inside, the position, the landscape position, the elevation, things like that, where the water accumulates is going to be a driving force of what kind of soil that you have. And the steepness and length of slope matter also. If you have a steep slope with no vegetative cover on it, you're going to have more water runoff. You're going to have more damage through winds. You're going to have more soil kind of find the bottom of the slope. And according to the NRCS, generally for most of the continental United States, soil on north-facing slopes tend to be cooler and wetter than soils on south-facing slopes. And south-facing slopes have a less thick A and B horizon, which was the topsoil and the subsoil. And the north-facing slopes have a greater, thicker A and B horizon, and they tend to be less droughty. Okay, time. Making soil takes time. Hundreds of thousands of years potentially. And time is required to get those soil horizons like we saw with those pictures. The A the OAE-BCR, all of those take time to form. And long exposure of soil surface to soil forming agents mean that there's greater development. And the older, the better for the soil. As a soil gets older, it has more well-defined soils and could, stop having new degradation to it. So we've talked about how soil forms, the different horizons, things of that nature, but we didn't talk about what soil is. We said it's minerals, organic matter, air, and water. Let's go into it a little bit more. Minerals. So mineral particles are defined by their size. You can have clay, you can have sand, silt, gravel, stone. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can do it. They are produced from the parent material itself when it's weathered and broken into smaller pieces from things like wind and water. And some of these minerals give you a soil texture. It's really the sand, silt, and clay that give you the soil texture. So we said it gets there through weathering. So there's mechanical weathering and there's chemical weathering. Mechanical weathering is when the physical forces of water, wind, rain break rock into smaller pieces without changing the rock's mineral compounds and composition. Chemical weathering is when chemical transformation of the rock is found into one or two or more compounds. So you can think of it like this. You have a piece of paper, you start ripping the piece of paper. You just have smaller pieces of paper, right? It might be the smallest thing ever, but it's still a piece of paper. If you're talking about chemical weathering, you have that same piece of paper and you're going to light it on fire. And you're going to light it on fire and you're going to let it burn. And then once it burns, you have ash, which isn't necessarily the piece of paper, so it underwent chemical weathering and produced something new entirely. So the mineral soils are usually made with sand, silt, and clays. And sands, you can see from these three circles, they're big, they're gritty. They're the biggest of the three components that you use to find soil texture. Silts is probably about this, not to scale, but this is about the size of my pointer. It's bigger, but it's very small compared to sand. It kind of feels like flour. And clays are sticky when wet. They're the smallest. And I mean, you can kind of see it, hopefully. It's even smaller than my pointer. So sand you can see easily with an unaided eye. Like think about the times you go to a beach. So like we were saying, soil texture, it's determined by the amount of sand, silt, and clay in a soil. And while organic matter does matter for in the soil, right, it has its own little section of what we want in there. It doesn't matter for when you're looking at the soil texture. So this is a fun slide. You can try it at home. If you want to take a look, see what your soil texture is, you want to do it yourself. So you start with some of the soil in your backyard, approximately 25 grams, and you're going to add water to it, and you're going to see, can I make it into a ball? If you can't make it into a ball and squeeze it and form it into a ball, can't do it. You probably have sand. If you can, okay, let's go down a step. And at this point, you're going to take your, I hope you can see this, you're going to take your thumb and your forefinger above a table. You don't want to do it on a table, and you're going to start to ribbon. You're going to push the soil through, and you're going to try to make a ribbon and see how long the ribbon you can get. You can do it 2-3 times, take an average just so you can see. And you're going to push it through and see how long these ribbons are. And you're seeing how much clay you have in your soil. If it's 2.5 inches or less, you're going to go down to this side. If it's 2.5 inches to 5 inches, you're going to go here. You might have a little bit more clay. And if it's going to be more than 5 centimeters, oh, sorry, centimeters, I said inches, you're going to go to this side where you have really clayey soil. So I did mine and I noticed that my ribbon was about 2.5 inches, nothing more. So I'm going to drop down here. The last thing you're gonna do is you're going to take a piece of the soil and put it in your hand and wet it a lot. And you're gonna rub your finger in the palm of your hand and feel the soil, feel it in the water. What's happening? Is it really gritty? Is it really gritty? You probably have a sandy loam. Does it feel really smooth, like you don't get any grit? You probably have a silty loam. Is it something that I don't really know, it's somewhere in the middle? You probably have a loam, and you can do this in any of these. You could have sandy loam, sandy clay loam, sandy clay. So it's just a fun activity to go outside on a nice day and kind of see what your soil is like in your backyard. Or you can get a test done. This looks scary, but I promise it's not. So if you get a test done and you find out the percentage of clay, silt, and sand in your soil, you can use your handy dandy soil texture triangle. So if it's gonna work. Okay, sorry about that. So I'm looking at clay first, just because. So clay goes this way. So it goes from 0 here, because we're following this axis. It goes from 0 to 100. So look at the directionality of your numbers when you're doing this. Say you have 80% sand, you see the directionality, it's dead on the number. So you're gonna read these lines. You're gonna go straight across. Just like that. For silt, it's going this way. So 0 is up here now, even though it's kind of confusing because you have 100, but we know that this is for clay. Silt is 0 here to 100. And you're gonna look at these lines and you're gonna say, okay, so the directionality of this 30 is kind of going this way, right? So we're gonna follow these lines, and these are gonna be the lines that you follow to find out your percentage of silt. And then lastly, you have sand, which is the triangle. It's the one left over side. So you have 0 here to 100 here. So it's gonna go like this. And look at the directionality of your numbers. 30 is facing kind of like this way. So you're gonna use these lines here. And you'll see all these dark lines, and these are going to tell you from your percentages what kind of soil you have. So we have clay here, and you can see here's where the lines are. So all of this is clay. So if you have something in here, it's clay. If you have something within these borders, it's loam. And let's try one just so we can, get a hang of it. So 10% clay, 20% sand, 70% silt. So we're going to look at clay first. So we know 10 to 100, and I did easy numbers. It could be like 87, 52, things of that nature. And then you just try to figure it out, right? Because everything's by 5, 70, 75, 80. So you just kind of, try to find where you think it would be logically. So clay is 10%. So clay, 10%. Here's my line of where the clay is. Sand, from 0 to 100, is 20%. So here is my line for sand, and silt is 70%. So here's my line here. So I'm going to look at it right there. That's where it meets. And I'm going to look at these outlines, these dark outlines, to find out what it is. It's a silt loam. So there's also aggregate structures and soil particles like the sand, silt, and clay. How they're arranged and grouped together during the aggregation process shows these structures and make these structures. Soil scientists call them PEDs. And the cementation of these of the several particles into the aggregate is how they're created. They affect the pore space, the movement of air, water, and root material. And sandy soils tend to be poorly developed structurally. So granular are small round units, and the blocky tend to be as wide as they are high. Some are rounded, some are angular. platy, which is down here. They look like dinner plates. They have sheets and they go horizontally like that. And it actually leads to a hard time for water to drain through. Prismatic, the top is angular and have a long vertical axis, and then there's structureless, either massive or single grain. The massive is exactly what you think. It's massive. And the single grain tends to be things like sand that doesn't come together and form any aggregates. Organic matter. So there's organic matter. We said we want about 5% in the soil, right? And this is anything that originates from a living organism. So there's plant residues, and we're going to call that the living. It includes microorganisms responsible for decomposition and breakdown of both plant residues into this organic matter. There's the detritus, which is the dead, and it's active decomposition. So this is when that live material is starting to become more stable. It's going through decomposition, and it's produced through those organisms that we talked about, fungi, things of that nature, protozoa, all that. And then there's also the humus, and the humus, you can think of it like very dead. It is the stable fraction of the soil. This is the end of decomposition. So it's more stable than the rest. And so the soil organic matter starts, and by the end of the process, it breaks down into humus and releases nutrients. It contributes to the soil's ability to hold onto water and nutrients, and it increases water infiltration, and surface runoff decreases. The NRCS says that soil organic matter holds 10 to 1,000 times more water and nutrients than the same amount of just mineral soil. Pore space, this one's a tricky one. It accounts for 2 sections for both the air and the water. And it's the space between soil solids. So it's anything that's not solid in a soil. There's macropores and there's micropores. Macropores are found between soil aggregates. They allow the flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide, water, roots to push through, things of that nature, and they're large. They're 0.05 millimeters in diameter. They help with soil aeration and porosity, and I'm gonna drop a lot of terms right now, but we will talk about them in a minute. And micropores are found between and within soil aggregates. So they retain water after watering and raining for the plants to use, and they're small. They're less than that 0.05 millimeters in diameter. And they help with water holding capacity, air movement or no air movement. There's no real air movement through them. And they're dominant in fine textured clay soils, and they reduce the movement of air and water. So what happens when you don't have those macropores? You have compaction. So the soil structure is destroyed and the macropores all collapse. So you'll see up here, it looks like a giant brick, and it really is a giant brick. You know, nothing can pass through it. Water has a hard time passing through it. Roots can't pass through it. It's a dense and physical barrier for roots and draining. So you can see in this picture down here, the soil that was there was compacted, probably from making the road that it's on and putting in these curb stops. So it was very compacted, and they just threw on a few a layer of soil and put the tree in. Well, we see the soil couldn't penetrate. You know, the roots can't go into older soil, so it really had a containerized effect. And when it fell, it pulled up all the roots, because that's all there were. That's where it was. What causes compaction? Things like excess machinery, and that also means cars, trucks, golf carts. If you're, driving through land, or you have people come over and park on the grass because there's not enough room, things of that nature. Using machinery when wet, and that also means cars. If it's raining outside, if the ground is wet, you know, it's not necessarily the best practice to do anything on the land, like drive trucks and things of that nature. Over-tilling can cause it, and inappropriate soil management. And how to fix it, you can reduce the use of everything I just said. You can increase organic matter content, and people also tend to aerate their soil. It's best to do it in the fall, and you'll see that people will fill holes with organic matter or sand. It's just a practice that they use to better help. And so after this, we're going to go into a little bit about water. So this is a video that we're going to watch if I take off my pointer. And this is from Dr. Nina Bassick at the Urban Horticulture Institute, which is part of Cornell. So I'm just going to get it to the part that I want. And press play.
Proxies for soil.
So they're using sponges.
You can see, this kitchen sponge is just, it's got pore space, it's got solids, it's got air, which is a good proxy for soil, which is about 50% solid, 25% water, and 25% air in an idealized situation. So we can use these sponges with different pore sizes to tell us how water moves in soils. So what I'm going to do here first is take this kitchen sponge and I'm going to put it underwater and squeeze all the air out of it. And then I'm going to let it open underwater. And then I'll bring it up into the air. And the point where there's no more air in the sponge but just water is called saturation. Now, saturation is when all the pores are filled with water. But of course, as soon as I bring it out of the water, it starts to drain via gravity. Gravity is pulling the water from the sponge down. We've still got plenty of water in the sponge, but it's not, even though gravity is still there, it's not being able to pull more water from the sponge. At that point, if we could assume that these drips are stopped, we call that field capacity, which is the amount of water a soil can hold against gravity, basically hold within its pores. So we have basically, this is field capacity now. Basically, most of the water is gone. Free water is gone via gravity. When I mean free water, it's the water in the big pores, which are called macropores, that are free to move via gravity. The water in the small pores, called micropores, are holding on to that water so that they're not able to be taken away by gravity. So then I say, this field capacity, this is the amount of water this sponge or this soil can hold. If we want to say, well, now it's able for the roots to get that water from the soil, I'm going to pretend I'm a root, but I'm just going to squeeze the sponge. So I'm a root getting the water from the sponge, which would be via osmosis, but we're just pretending. So I'm just squeezing the sponge until I can't really squeeze any more water out of it. And there's still plenty of water in this sponge, as you could all imagine. But it's held so tightly by the pores that roots are not able to get that water by osmosis. And at that point, we call this the permanent wilting point, where the soil has water in it, but it's held so tightly that roots cannot get the water. So between field capacity, which is after gravity drains the free water away, and where I've squeezed the water and you cannot get any more water off of the sponge, we call that the available water holding capacity of the soil. That's the amount of water any particular soil, and it varies from soil to soil, can hold against gravity and was holding so tightly in the pores that roots can't get it. So different soils have different available water holding capacities.
Okay. So so sorry. So when we're thinking about water, we're thinking about the video that we just saw. And we can compare it to a sponge. We talked about things like porosity, which is the amount of pores or open space between soil particles. So that's just the different sponges or the different types of soil. There is saturation, which is a soil's water holding content when the pore space is filled with water. So once you lifted it up and it was completely full. There's field capacity, which is water remaining in the soil 2 to 3 days after it's been saturated. So that's when she pretended she was a root and she squeezed it all out. You're going to see how much water you have. And water holding capacity, which is where the total amount of water a soil can hold at that capacity, at that location. And so now that we've covered all of the different pieces that make soil great, let's go into some different properties of soil. pH. So everyone knows about pH, right? So a pH is the amount of potential hydrogen, or pH, and it tells you the acidity or the alkalinity of a soil or anything at this point. So 7 is neutral, and 0 is very acidic, and 14 is very basic. And it is a logarithmic scale. So if you have something and you're at a level 6 and you go from a 6 to a 7, it's a tenfold change, or from it'll change tenfold since it's logarithmic. So if you're at a 7, you're thinking about pure water, right? If you wake up in the morning, you want some orange juice, you're going to be down at a 3. That orange juice gave you a stomach ache, you're going to pop back up to a 10 and have some milk and magnesia, about a 10 and a half. So everyday products as well as soil, really, there's a whole bunch to pH. And it's really beneficial in soil. From 2002 to 2006, Westchester County did a test. Most soils in Westchester are between a 6 to an 8. That's not to say every single soil in Westchester is. You know, we have done a few samples at the lab that are under 6. So it's not to say only, but a majority of them you can say are. And why is this important to me as a home landscaper? Why do I need to know about pH? Well, if you're planting blueberries, they tend to like a pH of 4 to 5.3, so you're acidic. If you're planting azaleas, they tend to like 4.5 to 6, so again, you're staying acidic. If you have lilacs, they can tolerate a more basic or alkali soil, but even though it's not preferred, they can deal with it. Do you have hydrangeas in your garden? The color of the flowers are going to change based on the pH. If you have a pH of 4.5, really acidic, the flowers will be a deep blue. If you have a 5.5 to a 6, they're going to be purple, and at a 7, they're going to be pink. Moss tends to grow on lawns when the pH is between 5 and 6, but that's not the only reason why moss grows on your lawn. It might be compacted, so before you do anything, you want to get a soil test to find out your pH. And nutrient availability differs. So here's a fun chart that shows you about pH and nutrient availability. The different macro and micronutrients have pHs where they're better absorbed and better taken in by the plants. So you can see nitrogen at the pH of 7, it's green, we're good. If you go down to a 4, 4.5, 5, not so great. So it really depends on the pH in your soil and the plants that you have. Some have adapted to needing different nutrients a little more. But your plants do need these nutrients and you want to make sure that they're available in the soil. Before changing soil pH, before putting fertilizer in, anything along that nature, I will just say, please get a soil test done to find out the pH, to find out the nutrient availability before you do it. Because with soil, it's not one of those things where more is better. You want to know how much you need to use and if you need to use it. And that is something that we can provide for you at the Cornell Cooperative Extension of Westchester. We can help you out there. If you want to increase the pH, which means you want to make it less acidic, maybe from like a 6 to a 7, you can do that by adding a few products. You can add a lime product. Lime ground agricultural lime is the most common. The timing for that, it's best in the fall, but if you do it 2 to 3 months before planting, that's good too. You need to add some water because it's only slightly water soluble, but follow the directions on the package on how much and when. And this could take a long time. It's not an instant fix. It can take upwards of 2 years depending on what kind of lime you put in. And you can also use wood ashes. The timing, it's best to do it in winter and incorporate it in the spring. It's not as effective as lime and it requires more application, and it works best in sandy soils. So if you want to decrease your pH or make it more acidic, right? So you're going from maybe a 7 to a 6, or you want to get to that 5.5 range for some of those acid loving plants, there's two options. You can use aluminum sulfate. It tends to change faster, but it is also a little bit more expensive. It must be worked into the soil. You'll find with both of these, the aluminum sulfate and sulfur, they need to be worked into the soil and they can burn a plant. So be wary when you do that, not to have any contact with any plant material. And with the sulfur, the soil bacteria have to convert the sulfur into sulfuric acid to create the reaction. So that's why it can take a little bit more time. So now we're going to go into a little bit of soil chemistry. We're learning about everything today, right? So this is a presentation or a video about the cation exchange capacity, which we'll talk about after.
Not all soils are created equal, and if it weren't for chemistry, we wouldn't be able to grow many crops here, nor here, nor here. It's like this. Soils are composed of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter. Some have more sand, others more clay. Each soil's unique blend determines its color, texture, and storage capacity for nutritious chemicals. Although incredibly small, nutrients still need their space. And by space, we mean the area surrounding the soil's tiny particles. Keep in mind that surface area is not the same as particle size. For example, clay particles are tiny compared to sand, but they have more than 1,000 times as much external surface area as the particles in an equal volume of sand. However, if a nutrient just sits there unattached, it will likely leach out from the soil when it rains and will not be available for plants. Remember that time when you rubbed a balloon on your best friend's hair and stuck it to a wall? Well, a similar phenomenon occurs in the soil. Through their electrostatic energy, nutrients cling on to clay particle surfaces. Nutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium, and ammonium are all positively charged chemicals, or cations. And as it turns out, most clay particles and organic matter in soil are negatively charged. So, many nutrients are positive and particles are negative. Perfect. In chemistry, as in romance, opposites attract. Good. No more leaching. But like the balloon on the wall, the nutrients are only temporarily held. In fact, there's actually a shell of water molecules that forms around the cation, preventing it from bonding permanently. This shell is often called a hydration sphere. But that's a whole other video. So, back to cations. Basically, if a plant wants a nutritious cation like potassium, it will need to exchange it for another cation or cations of equal charge. Luckily, plants produce hydrogen cations that they can exchange. One hydrogen cation for one potassium cation. Easy enough. But for nutrients with a positive charge of 2, like calcium, 2 hydrogen cations are needed. The higher the positive charge, the harder it gets to exchange or trade cations. That's because a cation with high positive charge and small size is preferentially held by the soil over those with lower charge or larger size, meaning that a large cation with a positive charge of 1 will be the first to be released. A divalent cation having a charge of 2 will be released more easily than a cation with a positive charge of 3. Whether they are held tightly or not, the nutrients are available to the plant in exchange for other cations. Not all nutrients are cations, however. Some are actually negatively charged compounds, or anions. Since anions, like nitrate or sulfate, have a negative charge, they are unable to attach themselves to negatively charged particles and, as a result, leach out when watered. Of course, all soils are different. There are soils in the tropics, for example, that have positively charged soil particles. And in that case, it's the anions, not cations, that are held temporarily and then exchanged with other anions. Most soils, however, have negatively charged particles. The more negatively charged a soil is and the more surface area a soil has, the more cation exchange capacity it has. This is such an important factor for plant growth that scientists measure a soil's cation exchange capacity, CEC, in order to help farmers determine how much and how often fertilization is needed. That's because CEC is sort of like a cup size at a fast food joint. Some soils are supersized, but others have a kiddie cup. Pouring too much will just cause a mess, but if you refill several times, you can still quench your thirst. Farming in low CEC soils works almost the same way. Even though the soil has lower capacity, you can fertilize more often using smaller amounts, and the plants will grow healthy and strong. And it's a good thing, too. Otherwise, we'd have very little land to farm. So the fact that farmers can grow crops almost anywhere kind of seems like superhero powers. But really, it's just knowing about chemistry.
Okay. So it's gonna play one more. So that was one toe into soil chemistry. So like they said in the video, the surface of most clays are negatively charged, so they attract positively charged ions. And the ability for these particles to hold onto these nutrients and ions and switch them out is how you figure out the cation exchange capacity. So we've talked about what soil is, we've talked about how it's made, we've talked about different principles in the soil. What's soil health? That's the big question. How do I get good soil health? So it's what we have to do is we have to stop thinking of soil as just a thing that's on the ground that you plant plants in, that you walk through, dirt, and start thinking of it as a living, breathing ecosystem, which reflects a shift in the way that we can manage our soils. And this is something put out by the NRCS, but it's living, breathing. There's tons of different nutrient cycling, absorbing. There's different draining and retaining water. There's different animals present. There's so much. It's not just one thing. You have to think of it as an ecosystem. So they also put out the 4 soil health principles, which are minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, maximize biodiversity, and maximize continuous living roots. So the right side, the maximize soil cover and minimize disturbance, you're going to want to think of this as a way to maintain or increase the stable soil aggregates and the soil organic matter, because we know how helpful those are. Protect the surface of the soil from wind and water, buffer against temperature fluctuations, and keeping organic matter highest at the soil surface. So you want to buffer against temperature fluctuations because you don't want the added stress on plants and organisms. It reduces evaporation rates and increases the amount of water entering in and all that good stuff, the water entering in. How do I do this? You do this by tilling less if you need it, only when you need it, and putting things in like intercropping. And intercropping is fun. You don't need to be a farmer to use intercropping. It's a better use of the growing area. Say you have some tomatoes in your garden, you have 2 rows of tomatoes, you have all that wasted space in between the 2 rows. So instead of having nothing there, we're going to have weeds, we're going to have soil run off with water and wind and things of that nature. And it'll cause problems, you can put something else in. You can put a different, like a legume or a grass or something of that nature, or even a trap crop, so that insects will go to that trap crop instead of your tasty tomatoes. And it'll also increase weed suppression. So it's really just a better use of your area. And the other two are going to be maximize continuous living groups and maximize biodiversity. And this, you're going to focus on feeding soil organisms, and increasing biodiversity will help you above and below the ground. You want to increase the diversity of soil animals and microorganisms there. Below the ground, you're going to increase the diversification, the roots and the organic matter and everything that uses to decompose. You're going to increase all of that. And above ground, you're going to be breaking disease cycles and providing habitat for things like pollinators and stimulating plant growth. And for this, you can use a cover crop. One of the things you can do, it's not the only one, but you can use a cover crop outside of your season, your summer season. You can plant something to overwinter on your ground, so you don't have any kind of degradation. You don't have the water on the soil, you don't have the wind on the soil, you have plant material and that root mass that's going to stabilize it and keep it in place. And you can even put something down like a vetch, an alfalfa, beans, something that fixates nitrogen with those mycorrhiza, different fungi, the great fungi that are actually going to put nutrition back into the soil while you're not using it. It's a win-win. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation today. The take home that I want to give to you is soil is alive and multifaceted. It's not just what you plant plants in. It's not just what you walk over. And different locations and timing will lead to different soils. So it's great to know what kind of soil you have instead of just guessing and putting things down, and it'll help you have a healthy soil. And by imparting all the different practices like cover crops and things of that nature, you can only even benefit from there. Okay, so we only have like 5 minutes left. So I think we can take a question or two. Okay, so someone asked about soil pH and what can average homeowners do to change their soil pH. I will say that step number one, please get a soil test before changing your pH. And like I said, Cornell Cooperative Extension, we can help you out with that because you want to know what you need to do. And if it's crop specific, if there's something that you want to grow or something that you notice isn't growing well, or a new garden you want to put in, find out as much as you can about the soil so you can help it to thrive. And then, you can put things like lime or sulfur down depending on what the soil test says. And you can just follow the directions on the bag and see how you apply it. Like I said, lime, it's best applied in the fall. And some of the other different products, you need to apply in winter and mix in the spring. So definitely follow the instructions on whatever kind of lime or product you get. And if you have any questions, you can also reach out to us. So here's our contact information. If I don't get to everyone's questions, which I won't because there's a whole bunch, or if you're in the middle of something with your garden and you have a question about how something looks, feel free to email us or call us. Our information's right there. And let me see if I can find another quick one. Okay. Someone asked about beech leaf disease and if something can be applied. There's not a whole lot known about beech leaf disease, so keep an eye out for it. As more research is being done, we'll be able to find out more about it and what needs to be done. Someone asked about coffee grounds and other compostable compounds, and if you have a compost, absolutely put it in. That's great. You're building the organic matter. It's a wonderful thing to do. Just make sure that you're testing your soil and you're not causing too much of a fluctuation in any pH one way or another, depending on what's inside it. And it looks like we're almost out of time. So I am actually just going to put this up here. So thank you so much for coming to this section of living in suburbia, the soil, what's in your yard. The next section is coming up on June 10th, like I said, from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. And it's water. Where does it come from? Where does it go? Thank you all so much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we look forward to seeing you for the next one. And like I said, if you have any questions, I'll leave this slide up for a minute. There's our phone number and our email address. Feel free to reach out.